This is Yemen, a country that's going through one of the world's largest humanitarian crises.
The country has been in the grips of a civil war between a Saudi-led Arab coalition and the Iran-backed Houthi rebel group.
Houthi rebels took control of the capital Sana'a in 2014, forcing the government into exile.
We're talking about 50% of the health facilities not operating.
After 8 years of war, could Yemen really be on the brink of peace?
You wouldn't expect it at first glance. Yemen has 3 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. Despite this huge wealth, Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world. The country could have been just as successful as the other countries in its region, but that leaves one thing out of the picture. In Yemen, there has been nearly a decade of brutal war. The government and economy in Yemen have collapsed, with severe consequences. According to UNICEF, around 21.6 million people in Yemen are lacking the most basic necessities like water or healthcare. Like in most conflicts, it all comes down to politics. In the case of Yemen, this is coming from both inside their borders and from the outside. Saudi Arabia, along with 9 of its allies, are also fighting in this war. And Iran, although it doesn't like to admit it, also plays an active role. Unfortunately for its citizens, Yemen has become a geopolitical war zone. In this war zone, tons of foreign countries and organizations want their own piece of the pie. But there's a question to be asked here. Why is this conflict, creating one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes on the planet, happening in the first place? The story behind the war in Yemen is complicated. It follows decades of civil unrest in the country because of a political and religious divide. But the situation is also closely tied to a much bigger and lesser-known conflict, the Middle Eastern Cold War. Yemen wouldn't be in such a dire condition if it weren't for Saudi Arabia and Iran. In this video, we'll go over how this disaster in Yemen is the unfortunate result of the Cold War in the Middle East. And as an unexpected plot twist, we'll also go over how and why China is trying to fix the conflict. Covering war, especially such a brutal one, is a dangerous game for me, since YouTube isn't a big fan of content that's not branded as friendly. This is why your likes matter even more on a video like this. If you can just take a second and hit that like button, it helps out this video a lot. When we hear about a Cold War, we immediately think of the one of the last century between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was a struggle for global influence, as both the US and the USSR wanted to achieve global hegemony. The two nations were too scared to fight each other directly because, well, it would mean the end of the world. That's why they decided to fight proxy wars. They supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world to win influence. Think about the Korean War and the Vietnamese War as classic examples of these wars. Now, at this very moment, there is another Cold War going on. Saudi Arabia and Iran are fighting each other for regional hegemony in the Middle East. It's the same playbook as the one in the Cold War that we all know about. In all of the conflicts in the Middle East we hear about on the news today, Iran and Saudi Arabia are trying to support opposing sides. Syria, Iraq, and also Yemen are examples of such conflicts where the two countries are involved. The only difference between this Cold War and the more well-known one of the last century is that this one is regional instead of global. Before we dive into this Cold War and how it actually affects Yemen, we have to understand why Iran and Saudi Arabia don't like each other in the first place. There are 2 explanations for this. The first one has to do with religion. Even though Iran and Saudi Arabia are both Muslim countries, they both support different branches of Islam. Iran is a Shia Muslim majority, where Saudi Arabia has a Sunni Muslim majority. Now, the two countries don't dislike each other because they have religious differences, but they do have a disagreement on who is supposed to be the leader of the Muslim world. Iran's supreme leader, basically the dictator of Iran, has absolute control over his country. He sees Iran as the head of the Muslim world because it strictly follows the Shia traditions. Saudi Arabia makes exactly the same claim because it has the 2 holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and it strictly follows the Sunni traditions. But everybody knows that there can only be one leader, so this creates a lot of tension. The second reason for the clash between the two are their different ideologies. Since its creation in 1932, Saudi Arabia has been ruled by the Saud monarchy. Saudi Arabia's politics have been a lot more stable and conservative than of Iran's. In 1953, the American CIA and the British MI6 staged a coup in Iran. This was to protect their oil interests after Iran nationalized their oil industry. Yes, it's truly always about oil in the Middle East, isn't it? After the coup, Iran got a pro-Western Western monarchy ruled by the infamous Shah, the Iranian king. Many Iranians didn't like his regime, which led to the Islamic Revolution led by Khomeini in 1979. After the revolution, the pro-Western monarchy was replaced by the supreme leader as we know of today. He is the political leader, but also the religious leader of the country. And this is key to understand. His full title is the Supreme Leader of the Revolution. To this day, Iran's leaders actively support the Islamic Revolution both inside and outside of their country. This includes fighting against Western influence in the Middle East, led by the United States. Saudi Arabia's monarchy doesn't support this at all. The United States is their top military supplier. Saudi Arabia doesn't mind having partnerships with Western countries, but Iran does. The other idea of the revolution is to oppose what Iran thinks are illegitimate forms of government. A long time ago, Khomeini defeated the illegitimate monarch in Iran, the Shah. What Saudi Arabia doesn't like is that the government of Iran wants to do the same in other countries. Across the region, Iran supports opposition and revolutionary groups to fight against their governments. The monarchy in Saudi Arabia sees this as a threat, because it doesn't want to have some kind of revolution of its own within its own borders. Saudi Arabia is kind of the status quo power, while Iran is much more revolutionary. Both countries want to be the leaders of the Middle East, and they have totally different visions for the region. In many countries, this was a recipe for disaster, including in Yemen. Just like Syria or Iraq, Yemen is part of this proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia support different sides in the conflict. It's important to understand what they're fighting over, though. Of course, getting influence in Yemen is a goal in its own for Iran and Saudi Arabia. Yemen is an important piece of the Arabian Peninsula, or should I say a vital piece of the Arabian Peninsula. For starters, Yemen is located right next to one of the most strategic waterways in the world. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait is a strategic link from the Red Sea to the Arabian Sea. A ton of ships go through this strait because it's a fast way to go from the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Approximately 10% of the world's trade goes through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, which makes it a $1 trillion asset. You can imagine that controlling this strait gives you a lot of power in the region and globally. When the Suez Canal got blocked for just 6 days in 2021, the entire world got hit with a nasty supply chain issue. And most of the ships going through the Suez Canal also pass through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Imagine what the effects of a deliberate blockade of the Bab el-Mandeb Strait would be. Because it's so important for trading routes, Iran and Saudi Arabia would love to control the strait in their quest for regional hegemony. Another important asset for trading routes is Yemen's main seaport, the port of Aden. If you want to get regional hegemony, taking control of important ports will help a great deal. And the port of Aden isn't just some port as you'll find anywhere else. It has one of the largest natural harbors in the world, ranking it one of the 5 best natural ports globally. Until 1950, it was the second busiest port in the world after New York. The port of Aden has a lot of potential, and that's an understatement. No wonder that Iran and Saudi Arabia take a special interest in this port. And of course, because Yemen sits right next to Saudi Arabia, it's an important piece in the Cold War. If Iran controls Yemen, it will have an edge over the Saudi Arabian military. A puppet state south of Saudi Arabia will give Iran some serious military advantages. It would be kind of similar to what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis so close to US territory, but then on a smaller and more regional scale. Obviously, Saudi Arabia doesn't want to have such a crisis happening next to their borders. And as Sun Tzu once said in The Art of War, attack is the secret of defense. So, Saudi Arabia sent troops into the country themselves. Yes, Saudi Arabia actually sent troops into the country. That is how far this Cold War goes. Let's look at the conflict in Yemen in a bit more detail. Yemen was already a failed state, even before the modern-day civil war began in 2014. In 2011, Ali Abdullah Saleh had been Yemen's corrupt president for more than 30 years. A UN report said he stole up to $60 billion during his reign. In the meantime, many Yemenis were impoverished and suffering from hunger. No wonder that many of Yemen's citizens weren't happy with their president. Therefore, in 2011, following the Arab Spring protests in many other Middle Eastern countries, the Yemeni Revolution began. What began as anti-government protests soon escalated into full-on war between the Saleh loyalists and opposition. Peaceful protesters were killed, and different tribes and militia were fighting government forces on the streets. In June, President Saleh was almost killed during an assassination attempt at the presidential palace. Saleh probably got the clue that his population didn't like him anymore, so he agreed to transfer power to his vice president, Hadi, in 2012. Many Yemenis were still not happy, though. Hadi won the quote-unquote election in which he was the only candidate. And it's not hard to win if you're the only one on the voting list. The situation once again escalated in 2014 when President Hadi decided to cut fuel subsidies. The Houthis, a militia in northern Yemen, decided to take over the capital Sana'a. The civil war had begun. The Houthis founded the Supreme Political Council and started to fight the officially recognized government of Hadi. The interesting thing is this: many countries, including the US and Saudi Arabia, believe that the Houthis are Iranian proxies. The evidence points to Iran giving direct military support to the group. The Houthis follow Shia Islam, just like Iran does. The supreme leader of Iran announced his spiritual support for the Houthis, but denies any military involvement in the conflict. However, President Hadi clearly doesn't believe this. He said that he would once again hoist the flag of Yemen in Sana'a instead of the Iranian flag. Unfortunately for the president, the Houthis weren't the only ones who wanted Hadi to go away. The old president, Saleh, criticized and denounced Hadi, just like the Houthis, and wanted him to give up power. Separatists in the south of the country who wanted to gain independence from the rest of Yemen seized the opportunity to join the fight. This southern movement was loosely allied with Hadi's government to protect the south from the advancing Houthis. But their new government, the Southern Transitional Council, took control over many of the provinces which once belonged to Hadi's government, which the president obviously didn't like. The terrorist group Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and the Islamic State also used the instability in Yemen to grow their influence in the country. Hadi's government had lost its grip on power, and the country was shattered into pieces. If you're not following this anymore with all the different groups and organizations involved, just understand this one. Yemen became a complete mess in a matter of months. When the Houthis threatened to take over Mecca and Riyadh, two cities in Saudi Arabia, the situation got even more out of hand. The day after that bold announcement, Saudi Arabia intervened in Yemen together with a coalition of 9 other countries. This includes the UAE, Egypt, Qatar, and Sudan. Basically, all of Saudi Arabia's friends joined the fight. The coalition supported Hadi's government and the southern movement in their fight against the Houthis. The Saudi coalition deployed thousands of troops and launched massive airstrikes. Interestingly enough, the US, the UK, and France all support the Saudi coalition in Yemen through massive arms sales. Many of the fighter jets, drones, and bombs come from Western countries. The West is allied with Saudi Arabia because they're enemies of Iran. And the enemies of your enemies are your friends, apparently. However, these arms sales are very controversial. Saudi Arabia and its coalition have repeatedly used these weapons to target civilians. They use what are called double-tap attacks. First, they strike military bases, and then they bomb the civilians who come to the rescue to help. Because of these tactics, what began as a Houthi insurgency escalated into one of the dirtiest conflicts in the world. Add to that a failing healthcare system, widespread malnutrition, and unhealthy drinking water, and the chaos is complete. By early 2022, the war had directly and indirectly cost around 377,000 lives in Yemen, and the country is still shattered into pieces. As you can see on this map, there are still 3 main camps fighting for control. The north, together with the capital Sana'a, is still controlled by the Houthis, most likely supported by Iran. The south is controlled by the southern movement, which has ties with the Saudi coalition, and the rest of the country is controlled by the official government of Yemen, supported by the Saudi coalition. You can't see these internal conflicts apart from the much bigger conflict in the Middle East. One side is pro-Iranian and the other side is pro-Saudi. That's why you call the conflict in Yemen a proxy war. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia would love to have more influence in Yemen. And perhaps more importantly, they both hate the idea of their competitor taking over control of the country. This is bad news for Yemen. The civil war won't stop until this Middle Eastern Cold War does. But the good news is that the Middle Eastern Cold War could be coming to an end.
We hope that this new chapter will end the stalemate in relations of the last 7 years and lead to greater stability and safety in the region, as well as to more development and prosperity for the people.
This deal heralds a new chapter in the Middle East. Bitter rivals Iran and Saudi Arabia agreed to restore diplomatic ties, all in secret with Chinese mediation.
This is probably the most important development in the Middle East of the century. Iran and Saudi Arabia, whose proxy wars have caused decades of conflict all over the Middle East, restored their relations. They did this with the help of China. This raises a few questions. Why are they doing this? And what is China doing in the Middle East? Fortunately for Yemen, an end to the Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia could mean the end of war. When Iran stops sending support to the Houthis and when Saudi Arabia stops helping Yemen's government and the southern movement, the conflict could cool down. A month ago, Saudi and Houthi UT officials held talks on the rebuilding of Yemen and reopening ports and airports. They also discussed a timeline for foreign forces to exit the country. These are hopeful signs of the now 9-year war potentially coming to an end. It seems that Iran and Saudi Arabia are changing their minds about the war. Maybe they've realized after nearly a decade of war that there's no point in fighting and that there are only losers in war. Both Iran and Saudi Arabia haven't quite achieved dominance in Yemen, and above all, not the regional hegemony they would both like. But apart from that, China could also have something to do with the sudden policy shift. China is trying to win influence all over the world, and particularly in the Middle East. Why? Oil, of course. China needs a ton of oil for its economy. In the Middle East, it's a pretty great place to get it. So, as a part of its master plan, China wants to get as many friends as possible in the region. And this Cold War between Iran and Saudi Arabia doesn't fit with China's interests, because China doesn't want to pick sides between the two. Keep in mind that China is the largest trading partner with both Saudi Arabia and Iran, bringing in vast amounts of imports and exports for the two countries. Money talks, so China has an edge here. Beijing can put pressure on Saudi Arabia and Iran to stop fighting each other, which is exactly what they're doing. The CCP pressured Saudi Arabia and Iran to resume their ties and to start talks about ending their proxy wars. China's leader, Xi Jinping, has two motives for doing this. The first one has to do with the so-called soft power points. We all know that the CCP sees itself as a global leader, competing with the United States in this role. But to be called a true global leader, you need the approval of the rest of the world. In other words, you need soft power, and a lot of it. The United States got this after the Second World War, where it got loads of soft power points by defeating Japan and Germany. The rest of the world looked to the United States more positively. If China manages to bring peace to the Middle East, the CCP will do the same thing. Middle Eastern countries will look at China more positively, which in turn will improve China's soft power. If China wants to compete with the US as a global leader, bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia back together is gonna help quite a lot. So that's the first motive, soft power. The second motive for China ending the Cold War are business interests. The Middle Eastern Cold War has caused a great deal of conflict in the region, which doesn't help Chinese business interests. The CCP wants to make money in the Middle East, and Yemen is a good example of this. In the last few months alone, Chinese diplomats have held 5 separate meetings with the government of Yemen. A CCP report said that Yemen has a lot of potential waiting to be tapped. When the war comes to an end, China wants to invest in the post-war reconstruction and development of the country. In other words, Beijing wants to make a lot of money and gain a ton of influence by bringing peace to Yemen. To give them their credit, peace is a good thing, but these Chinese investment schemes have built themselves quite a reputation. Many projects in Xi Jinping's infamous Belt and Road Initiative have failed. When China is talking about reconstructing and developing Yemen, you shouldn't get too excited. Yemen will be yet another part of this Belt and Road Initiative, which doesn't have a good track record for itself. But one thing is certain, this is a huge change for both Yemen and the Middle East as a whole. One of the most deadly wars of the 21st century could be coming to an end, and the Middle East could get a lot more stable. Another thing that's coming to an end is Russia's arms export industry. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, their arms export numbers have dropped drastically. Click on the video on your screen to learn about how these drops in exports could mean the end of Russia's economy. And be sure to subscribe to my new channel, Basics Daily, where I cover geopolitics news on a daily basis.